I will not undertake to describe the cortege, although my recollections of it are still fresh and complete. But I should have too many things to say. Imagine 10,000 cavalrymen in splendid uniforms defiling between two ranks of equally brilliant infantry, each line being nearly half a league in length. Think of the number of the equipages and their richness, the beauty of the horses and the uniforms, of that multitude of musicians playing the coronation marches to the sound of bells and of cannon. Then add the effect produced by the concourse of 4,000 or 5,000 spectators. And even then, you will still be far from having a just idea of this astonishing magnificence. The weather is seldom fine in the month of December, but on this day the skies seemed favorable to the emperor. At the moment he entered the archbishop's palace, a rather heavy fog which had hung on all the morning disappeared and permitted the sun to add the luster of his rays to the splendor of the cortege. This singular circumstance was noticed by the spectators and increased their enthusiasm. All the streets through which the procession passed had been scrupulously cleaned and sanded. According to their tastes and their means, the inhabitants had decorated the fronts of their houses with draperies, tapestries, colored paper, and some with garlands of evergreens. Nearly all the shops on the Quai d'Orfèvre were decked with festoons and artificial flowers. The religious ceremony lasted nearly 4 hours and must have been inexpressibly fatiguing for the principal actors. The chamber servants were obliged to remain constantly in the apartment prepared for the emperor at the archbishop's palace. The curious, however, and that included all of us, left it from time to time and could thus see the ceremony at their leisure. I think I have never heard such fine music. It was composed by Messieurs Pacello, Rose, and Lesueur, chapel masters to their majesties. The orchestra and choruses combined, the first talent of Paris. 2 orchestras of 4 choirs composed of more than 300 musicians were directed, the one by Monsieur Persuit and the other by Monsieur Ray, both of them chief musicians to the emperor. Monsieur Lay, his majesty's first singer, Messieurs Kreutzer and Bayeux, his first violinist, had added all that the imperial chapel, the opera, the great lyric theaters possessed of superior talent, whether instrumental or vocal. The military bands were innumerable, and under the orders of Mr. Lesueur, these executed heroic marches, of which one commanded by the emperor from Mr. Lesueur for the army of Bologna still ranks in the judgment of connoisseurs among the finest and most imposing of musical compositions. For my part, the music made me turn pale and tremble. I shuddered from head to foot in listening to it. His Majesty would not have the Pope put his crown on his head. He placed it there himself. It was a diadem of oak and laurel and gold. His Majesty afterwards took the crown intended for the Empress, and after holding it over her a few moments, placed it on the head of his august spouse. On her knees before him, she was shedding tears of emotion, and on rising fixed a glance of tenderness and gratitude on the emperor, who returned it, but without losing the gravity required by so imposing a ceremony in the presence of spectators. And yet, in spite of this constraint, their hearts comprehended each other in the midst of this brilliant and noisy assembly. Certainly, the idea of the divorce was not then in the emperor's mind, and for my part, I am sure that this cruel separation would never have taken place if Her Majesty the Empress could still have had children, or even if the young Napoleon, son of the King of Holland and Queen Hortense, had not died at the time the emperor was thinking of adopting him. Yet I must own that the fear, or rather the certainty, of not having from Josephine an heir to his throne reduced the emperor to despair. And I have often heard him suddenly interrupt his work with the vexed exclamation, "To whom shall I leave all this?" After the Mass, His Excellency Cardinal Fesch, Grand Almoner of France, carried the book of the Gospels to the Emperor, who from his throne pronounced the imperial oath in a voice so firm and distinct that all who were present heard it. It was then that, for perhaps the 20th time, the cry of "Long live the Emperor" came from every mouth. The Te Deum was chanted, and their Majesties left the church with the same pomp with which they had entered it. The Pope remained in the church for a quarter of an hour after the sovereigns, and when he rose to retire, universal acclamation saluted him from the chancel to the door. It was 6:30 when their majesties returned to the chateau, and the Pope did not come until 7. To enter the church, their majesties passed, as I have said, through the Archbishop's palace, the buildings of which communicated with Notre Dame by means of a wooden gallery. This gallery, covered with slates and hung with superb tapestries, ended at a portal, also in carpenter's work, established in front of the principal entrance of the church, and in a style in perfect harmony with the Gothic architecture of this beautiful cathedral. This flying portal rested on 4 columns decorated with inscriptions in gilded letters, which represented the names of the 36 principal cities of France, the mayors of which had been deputed to be present at the coronation. On the upper part of these columns, Clovis and Charlemagne were painted in relief, sitting on their thrones, scepter in hand. In the center of the frontispiece were represented the arms of the empire, shadowed by the flags of 16 cohorts of the Legion of Honor. On the 2 sides were 2 turrets surmounted by golden eagles. The under part of this portico, as well as the gallery, were vaulted, painted sky blue, and bestrewn with stars. The throne of their majesties was raised upon a semicircular platform covered with a blue carpet studded with bees. 22 steps led up to it. This throne, draped in velvet, was surmounted by a canopy of the same material, the left wing of which shaded the empress, the princesses, and their ladies of honor, and the right one of the 2 brothers of the emperor, the arch-chancellor, and the arch-treasurer. Nothing could be more magnificent than the spectacle afforded by the garden of the Tuileries on the evening of this beautiful day. The grand parterre, surrounded by porticos and lanterns, from each arcade of which hung garlands of colored lamps. The grand alley, decorated with colonnades, surmounted by stars, orange trees of fire on the terraces. Each tree of the other alleys illuminated by lanterns, finally to crown the illumination, an immense star suspended over the Place de la Concorde, dominating all the other fires. It was a palace of fire. On the occasion of the coronation, His Majesty made magnificent presents to the Metropolitan Church. Among other things was remarked a chalice in silver gilt, ornamented with bas-reliefs designed by the celebrated Germain, a ciborium, 2 cruets with their tray, a holy water vase, and an offertory plate, all in silver gilt and curiously wrought. By His Majesty's orders, transmitted through the Minister of the Interior, there was also sent to Monsieur d'Astro's canon of Notre Dame a case containing the crown of thorns, a nail, and a fragment of the wood of the true cross. A little bottle containing, it was said, some of the Savior's blood, an iron discipline which had been used by St. Louis, and also a tunic that had belonged to that king. In the morning, Marshal Murat, governor of Paris, had given a magnificent breakfast to the German princes who had come to Paris to be present at the coronation. After the breakfast, the marshal governor had them taken to Notre Dame in 4 6-horse carriages with an escort of 100 men on horseback, commanded by one of his aides-de-camp. This cortege was particularly noticed on account of its elegance and richness. The morrow this great and memorable ceremony was a day of public rejoicings. From early morning, an innumerable throng of people, favored by splendid weather, swarmed over the boulevards, the wharfs, and the squares, where the infinite variety of diversions had been arranged. Heralds at arms passed through the public places at an early hour, throwing to the crowd which pressed upon the medals struck in memory of the coronation. These represented on one side the figure of the emperor, his forehead encircled by the crown of the Caesars, with the legend, Napoleon, Emperor. On the reverse was a figure in the costume of a magistrate, surrounded with appropriate emblems, and that of an ancient warrior raising on a buckler a crowned hero covered with an imperial mantle. Below this was engraved the Senate and the people. As soon as the heralds had passed, the rejoicings began and were prolonged far into the evening. On Place Louis XV, then called Place de la Concorde, 4 large square galleries had been erected in carpenters' and joiners' work for dancing. Stages for pantomime and farce had been placed at regular intervals along the boulevards. Groups of singers and musicians executed national airs and warlike marches. Greased poles, rope dancers, and games of every kind stayed the spectators at every step and caused them to await without impatience the moment for the illuminations and the fireworks. The illuminations were admirable. From the Place Louis XV to the extremity of the Boulevard Saint-Antoine, there was a double cordon of colored lamps and garlands. The former Garde Meuble, the palace of the Court Legislatif, glittered with lights. The Saint-Denis and Saint-Martin gates were covered with lanterns from top to bottom. In the evening, all the sightseers went to the quays and bridges to see the fireworks, which were set off from the Pont de la Concorde, now Pont Louis XVI, and surpassed in brilliancy all that had been seen until then. Chapter 3. On Wednesday, December 5th, 3 days after the coronation, the emperor made the distribution of flags on the Champ de Mars. The facade of the military school was decorated by a gallery composed of tents placed on a level with the apartments of the first story. The middle tent, fixed upon 4 columns, bore gilded figures representing victory, covered the throne of their majesties. It was an excellent precaution, for on that day the weather was horrible. The thaw had suddenly set in, and everybody knows what a Parisian thaw is like. Around the throne were placed the princes and princesses, the great dignitaries and ministers, and the marshals of the empire, the great officers of the crown, the ladies of the court, and the council of state. The gallery was divided to right and left into 16 compartments decorated with military ensigns and crowned by eagles. These 16 compartments represented the 16 cohorts of the Legion of Honor. The right was occupied by the Senate, the officers of the Legion of Honor, the Court of Cassation, and the chiefs of the national accounts. On the left were the tribunal and the corps legislatif. At each end of the gallery was a pavilion that on the city's side was called the Imperial Tribunal and was destined for the foreign princes. The diplomatic corps and foreigners of distinction occupied the other. The descent from this gallery into the Champ de Mars was by an immense staircase, the first step of which served as a bench below the tribunes and was lined with the presidents of cantons, prefects, sub-prefects, and members of the municipal council. On the 2 sides of this staircase were colossal figures of France making peace and France making war. On the steps were arranged colonels of regiments and presidents of the electoral colleges of the departments, who bore the imperial eagles. The cortege of their majesties left the Tuileries at noon in the order adopted for the coronation. The chasseurs of the guard and the squadron of Mamelukes marched in front. The picked legion of mounted grenadiers followed. The municipal guard and the grenadiers of the guard formed the line. Their majesties, having entered the military school, received the homage of the diplomatic corps, who had been introduced for that purpose into the grand apartments of the school. Afterwards, the emperor and empress put on once more the coronation ornaments and sat down upon the throne, to the roar of repeated discharges of artillery and universal acclamations. At a given signal, the deputations of the army spread out over the Champ de Mars, closed up in serried columns, and approached the throne to the blare of drums. The emperor having risen, the greatest silence was restored, and in a loud voice the emperor pronounced these words: "Soldiers, behold your flags. These eagles will always serve you as a rallying point. They will be wherever your emperor deems their presence necessary for the defense of his throne and his people. You swear to sacrifice your life to defend them and to maintain them constantly by your courage on the path of victory. You swear it." "We swear it," repeated all together the colonels and the presidents of the colleges, waving the flags they held in the air. "We swear it," repeated in turn the whole army, while the bands played the celebrated march known as the Flag March. This movement of enthusiasm communicated itself to the spectators who, in spite of the rain, were thronging in crowds on the benches which encircled the Champ de Mars. Presently, the eagles were taken to the places destined for them, and the army defiled by divisions in front of their majesties, although no effort had been spared to give this ceremony all possible magnificence. It was not brilliant. The motive only was imposing, but how satisfy the eye through torrents of melted snow in the midst of a sea of mud, which was the aspect of the Champ de Mars presented on that day? The troops had been under arms since 6 o'clock in the morning, exposed to the rain and forced to receive it without any appearance of utility. That, at least, was the way in which they considered the question. The distribution of flags was to these men nothing but a review, pure and simple, and certainly it is a different thing in a soldier's eyes to receive the rain on a battlefield and on a fete day with a well-polished musket and an empty cartridge box. The cortege returned to the Tuileries at 5 o'clock. There was a grand banquet in the Gallery of Diana. The Pope, the sovereign elector of Ratisbonne, the princes and princesses, the great dignitaries, the diplomatic corps, and many other persons were invited. The table of their majesties, laid in the middle of the gallery upon a platform, was covered by a magnificent canopy. The emperor seated himself on the right of the empress and the pope on her left. The pages waited on the table. The grand chamberlain, the grand equerry, and the colonel general of the guard remained standing before his majesty. The grand marshal of the palace on his right, and in front of the table, and lower down, the prefect of the palace. On the left and opposite the marshal, the grand master of ceremonies also remained standing. On either side of the table, their majesties were those of their imperial highnesses, of the diplomatic corps, of the ministers and great officers, and finally that of the empress's lady of honor. After dinner, there was a drawing room, a concert, and a ball. The next day, after the distribution of the eagles, His Imperial Highness Prince Joseph presented the presidents of the electoral colleges of the departments. The presidents of the district colleges and the prefects were introduced afterwards and received by His Majesty. The emperor conversed with the majority of these functionaries on the needs of each department, thanking them for their zeal in supporting him, and then especially recommending them to the execution of the law on conscriptions. Without the conscription, said His Majesty, there can be neither power nor national independence. All Europe is subjected to the conscription. Our success and the strength of our position depend on our having a national army. We must carefully adhere to this advantage. These presentations lasted for several days. His Majesty received in turn, and always with the same ceremonial, the presidents of the high courts of justice, the presidents of the general councils of the departments, the subprefects, the colonial deputies, the mayors of the 36 principal cities, the presidents of cantons, the vice presidents of the chambers of commerce, and the presidents of consistories. Some days later, the city of Paris offered to their majesties a fete whose brilliancy and magnificence surpassed all possible description. The emperor, the empress, the Princess Joseph, and Louis went to it together in the coronation carriage. Batteries placed on the Pont Neuf announced the moment when their majesties set foot on the flight of steps leading to the Hôtel de Ville. At the same instant, buffets laden with pieces of fowl and fountains of wine attracted to the principal square of each of the 12 municipalities of Paris an immense multitude, nearly every individual of which had his share in the distribution of eatables, thanks to the precaution of the authorities not to give a single piece except upon the presentation of a billet. The front of the Hôtel de Ville was illuminated by colored lamps. What struck me most was the sight of a war vessel pierced for 80 cannon, whose bridges, masts, sails, and shrouds were outlined by illuminations. The bouquet of the fireworks to which the emperor himself applied the match represented Mont Saint Bernard, belching forth a volcano in the midst of its snow-covered rocks. Upon it could be seen the figure of the emperor blazing with light, ascending on horseback at the head of his army, the craggy summit of the mount. There were more than 700 persons at the ball without the slightest disorder. Their majesties retired early. The empress, on entering the apartment which had been prepared for her at the Hôtel de Ville, had found there a gold toilette service, completely furnished and of the greatest richness. When it was brought to the Tuileries, it was for several days a favorite toy and the subject of all Her Majesty's conversations. She wanted everybody to admire this piece of furniture, and in fact no one needed to be urged to do so. Their Majesties permitted this toilet set and a service likewise presented to the emperor by the city of Paris to be exposed to public curiosity during several days. After the fireworks, a superb balloon was sent up, the whole circumference of which, as well as the car and the cords which attached it to the balloon, were decorated with luminous garlands of colored lamps. It was a magnificent spectacle, this enormous mass rising slowly but lightly into the air. For some time it remained suspended over Paris as if waiting until public curiosity should be satisfied, then seeming to have found a more rapid current of air at the height it attained, it disappeared before the wind in a southerly direction. Seeing it no longer, people ceased to think about it, but 15 days later, a very singular incident recalled universal attention to this balloon. One morning, while I was dressing the emperor, it was, I think, either New Year's Day or the day before, one of His Majesty's ministers was introduced, and the emperor, having asked him what was the news of Paris, as he was accustomed to do of those whom he saw early in the morning, the minister replied, I left Cardinal Caparat very late yesterday, and I heard the strangest thing from him. What is it? What is it about? And His Majesty, doubtless fancying that some political matter was in question, was making ready to lead his minister into his cabinet before completely finishing his toilet, when His Excellency hastened to add, it was nothing serious, sire. Your Majesty has not forgotten that someone was speaking lately at Her Majesty the Empress's drawing room of the chagrin of that poor Garnerin, who has not been able up to the present to find the balloon he launched on the day of the fete offered to the emperor by the city of Paris. This very day he is about to receive news of his aerostat. Where did it fall? Asked the emperor. At Rome, sire. Ah, that is curious, in fact. Yes, sire. Garnerin's balloon has shown your imperial crown within 24 hours to the two capitals of the world. Thereupon the minister related to His Majesty the following details, which were made public at the time, but which I think sufficiently interesting to induce my readers to pardon me for recalling it here. The balloon bearing this letter was launched at Paris, the 25th Frimaire, in the evening of December 16th by Monsieur Garnerin, licensed aeronaut of His Majesty the Emperor of Russia, and ordinary aeronaut of the French government on the occasion of the fete given by the city of Paris to His Majesty the Emperor Napoleon to celebrate his coronation. Persons finding this balloon are requested to inform Monsieur Garnerin, who will repair to the spot. In writing this billet, the aeronaut doubtless expected to be notified the next day that his balloon had descended either in the plain of Saint-Denis or in that of Grenelle, for it is to be presumed that he hardly thought of a journey of Rome when he promised to repair to the spot. More than 15 days elapsed without his receiving the notification he had expected, and he had probably given up hopes of his balloon when he received a letter in these terms from the nuncio of His Holiness. Cardinal Caparat has just been commissioned by His Excellency, Cardinal Gonsalvi, the Secretary of State of His Holiness, to remit to Monsieur Garnerin the copy of a letter dated December 18th. He hastens to send it to him, and even to adjoin the copy of the accompanying dispatch. The said Cardinal seizes this occasion to express to Monsieur Garnerin all his esteem. To this letter was joined a translation of the report to the Cardinal Secretary of State at Rome by Monsieur le Duc de Mondragon, and dated from Angulera, near Rome, December 18th. Yesterday evening, about the 24th hour, there was seen passing through the air a globe of astonishing size, which, having fallen on the lake of Bracciano, seemed to be a house. Boatmen were sent out to bring it to land, but they could not succeed, being beaten back by an impetuous wind accompanied by snow. Early this morning, they contrived to bring it ashore. This globe is of gummed taffeta covered with a net. The gallery of iron wire is slightly broken. It seems to have been illuminated by lanterns and colored lamps, some vestiges of which remain attached to this globe. The following notification, that which appears above, was found. Hence, this balloon, having started from Paris December 16th at 7 in the evening and having descended the next day, the 17th, near Rome, at the end of the 24th hour, that is, at the close of the day, had traversed France, the Alps, etc., and gone over a distance of 300 leagues in 22 hours. Its speed then must have been 15 leagues an hour, and what is remarkable, it was loaded with decorations weighing 500 pounds. The history of the previous excursions of this balloon is given to stimulate curiosity. Its first ascension took place in the presence of their Majesties and all the court. It carried Monsieur Garnerin, his wife, and Monsieur Gartner, and descended on the frontiers of Saxony. The second experiment was made at St. Petersburg before the emperor, the two empresses, and the court. The balloon carried Monsieur and Madame Garnerin and came down in a marsh at no great distance. This was the first time that the spectacle of balloon ascension had been seen in Russia. The third experiment was likewise made in St. Petersburg in presence of the imperial family. Monsieur Garnerin went up with General Wolfe, These two voyagers were borne over the Gulf of Finland during 3/4 of an hour and descended at Krasnosalo, 25 versts from St. Petersburg. The fourth experiment took place at Moscow. Monsieur Corduran rose to a height of more than 4,000 fathoms and came down at the end of 7 hours, some 300 versts from Moscow on the line of the old Russian frontier. The same balloon was used for the ascension made at Moscow by Madame Corduran and Madame Tuchinov in the midst of a frightful storm and discharges of lightning which killed 3 men. At 300 paces from the balloon, at the moment when it rose, these ladies descended without accident. 21 versts from Moscow. The city of Paris gave a reward of 600 francs to the boatman who rescued the balloon from Lake Bracciano. The balloon was brought to Paris and deposited in the archives of the Hôtel de Ville. I was a witness that very day of the kindness with which the emperor received the petition of a poor woman whose husband, who was, I think, a notary, had been condemned to a long imprisonment for I do not know what fault. Just as the carriage of their imperial highnesses was passing in front of the Palais Royal, 2 women, one already aged, the other about 16 or 17, sprang out of the door crying, "Pardon for my husband, pardon for my father." The emperor at once shouted an order for his carriage to be stopped and put out his hand to take the petition, which the elder of the 2 ladies would give to no one but him. He spoke to her at the same time in a compassionate manner, expressing with touching interest his fear lest she might have been hurt by the horses of the marshals who were riding beside the carriage, while this kindliness of his august brother was exciting the utmost enthusiasm in the spectators of the scene. Prince Louis, who was on the front seat of the carriage, had leaned out to reassure the trembling young girl, making her promise to console her mother and rely on the interest of the emperor. Suffocated by their emotion, neither mother nor daughter could make any response, and just as the cortege began to move forward, I saw the former on the point of fainting. She was taken into an adjoining house where she came to herself only to shed tears of gratitude and joy, along with her daughter. The Corps Legislatif had decreed that a statue in white marble should be erected to the emperor in the Assembly Hall in commemoration of the drawing up of the Civil Code. On the day of the inauguration of this monument, Her Majesty the Empress, Princes Joseph, Louis, Borghese, Bacciochi, and their wives, other members of the imperial family, deputations from the principal orders of the state, the diplomatic bodies, and foreigners of note, the ministers, the marshals of the empire, and a considerable number of general officers repaired towards 7 o'clock in the evening to the palace of the Corps Legislatif. At the moment when the empress entered the hall, the entire assembly rose, and a band placed in an adjoining hall began Gluck's well-known chorus. Kid de Tray, Kid de Majesty. Hardly were the first strains of this chorus recognized when everyone greeted with enthusiasm its felicitous appropriateness and shouted applause from every side. On the invitation of the president, Marshals Murat and Massena lifted the veil covering the statue, and all eyes were turned on the image of the emperor, his forehead crowned with a wreath of laurel blended with oak and olive leaves. When silence had succeeded to the applause excited by this spectacle, Monsieur Vautblanc ascended the tribune and delivered a speech which was vigorously applauded by the assembly, whose sentiments it faithfully expressed. "Gentlemen," said the orator, "you have signalized the completion of the civil code of the French people by an act of admiration and gratitude. You have awarded a statue to the illustrious prince, whose firm and constant will has caused the accomplishment of the great work, while at the same time his vast intelligence has shed the most vivid light upon this noble portion of human institutions. First consul, then emperor of the French today, he appears in the temple of laws, his head adorned with the triumphal crown with which victory so often encircled it as a presage of the royal diadem, and covered with the imperial mantle, the noble attribute of the first among human dignities. Doubtless on this solemn day, in the presence of the princes and the great ones of the state, and of the august person whom the empire distinguishes by his inclination to do good, still more than by the high rank of which this virtue makes him so worthy, in this fete of glory to which we should like to assemble the whole French people, you will permit my feeble voice to lift itself for a moment to remind you of the immortal actions by which Napoleon opened this immense career of power and honor. If praise corrupts weak souls, it is the element of great ones. The splendid actions of heroes are a promise made by them to their country. To recall them is to remind them that we expect still more of those grand thoughts, those generous sentiments, those glorious deeds so nobly recompensed by public admiration and gratitude. Victorious in 3/4 of the world, peacemaker of Europe, legislator of France, thrones bestowed, provinces added to the empire, is this enough glory to merit both the august title of Emperor of the French and this monument erected in the Temple of Laws? Well, I myself am going to efface these brilliant souvenirs, which I have just recalled, in a louder voice than that which resounded in his praise. I'm about to say to you, annihilate in thought this glory of the legislator, this glory of the warrior, and say to yourselves, before the 18th Brumaire, when fatal laws had been promulgated and destructive principles proclaimed anew, were already sweeping men and things away with a rapidity which it would soon have been impossible to arrest. Who was it that suddenly appeared like a beneficent star who came to abrogate those laws, to close the yawning abyss? You live, all of you, then, menaced by the evil of the times. You live, and you owe it to him whose image you behold. You hasten hither, unfortunate proscripts. You breathe the sweet air of your fatherland. You embrace your fathers, your children, your wives, your friends, and you owe it to him whose image you behold. It is not now a question of his glory. I no longer bear witness to it. I invoke humanity on one side and gratitude on the other. I ask you, to whom you owe a happiness so great, so extraordinary, so unforeseen. You will all of you reply with me. It is to the great man whose image you behold. When the president's turn came, he repeated a similar eulogy in scarcely different terms. There were few persons at that time who dreamed of finding these praises exaggerated. Perhaps they have changed their opinions since. After the ceremony, the Empress, conducted by the president, passed into the hall of conferences where Her Majesty's table had been laid under a magnificent canopy of crimson silk, tables comprising nearly 300 covers and served by Hubert, the restaurant keeper, had been laid in different halls of the palace. To the dinner succeeded a brilliant ball. The most remarkable thing about this fete was its unimaginable luxury of flowers and shrubs, which could hardly have been got together without great expense, considering the severity of the winter. The Lucrece Hall and that of the Réunion, where the quadrilles were danced, were like an immense parterre of oleanders, lilacs, jonquils, lilacs, lilies, and jasmines. Chapter 4. It was on January 2nd, just a month after the coronation, that I formed a union with the eldest daughter of Monsieur Charvet, which has made thus far, and will, I hope, make to the end the happiness of my life. I have promised the reader to speak very little of myself, and in fact, what interest could those details of my private life possess, which have no reference to the great man in view of whom I have undertaken to write my memoirs? Nevertheless, I will ask permission at this point to go back a little to this epoch, which is the most interesting of all to me, and which besides has shaped my existence. Doubtless, it is not forbidden to a man who searches and recalls his souvenirs to count for something those which more particularly concern himself. Moreover, even among the most personal events of my life, there are still circumstances to which their majesties were not strangers, and which consequently it is most important to know if one wishes to form a complete estimate of the characters of the emperor and the empress. My wife's mother had been presented to Madame Bonaparte during the first Italian campaign and had pleased her. For Madame Bonaparte, who was so perfectly kindly and who had also known misfortune, knew how to compassionately help the affliction of others. She promised to interest the general in the fate of my father-in-law, who had just lost a place in the treasury. During this time, Madame Charvet was in correspondence with a friend of her husband, who was, I think, General Bonaparte's courier. The former opened and read the letters addressed to his courier, and he asked who was the young woman who wrote to him with so much wit and intelligence. In fact, Madame Charvet was very well worthy of this double eulogy. My father-in-law's friend took occasion from this question to relate the misfortune of the family. On his return to Paris, the general said that he would like to see Monsieur and Madame Charvet. Consequently, they were presented, and Madame Bonaparte was delighted to learn that her protégés had also become those of her husband. It was decided that Monsieur Charvet should follow the general to Egypt, but on arriving at Toulon, Madame Bonaparte asked that my father-in-law should accompany her to the baths of Plombières. I have previously described the accident that happened at Plombières, and Monsieur Charvet's mission to Saint-Germain to withdraw Mademoiselle Hortense from boarding school. On returning to Paris, he hunted through all the environs to find a country house which the general had commissioned his wife to buy in his absence. When Madame Bonaparte had decided upon Malmaison, Monsieur Charvet, his wife, and their 3 children were established in this charming residence. My father-in-law devoted his whole attention to the interests of the benefactress of his family, and Madame Charvet often served as private secretary to Madame Bonaparte for her correspondence. Mademoiselle Louise, who became my wife, and Mademoiselle Zoe, her younger sister, were Madame Bonaparte's favorites, especially the second, who spent more time than Louise at Malmaison. The kindness of their noble benefactress had rendered this child so familiar that she habitually thee'd and thou'd Madame Bonaparte, to whom she said one day, "Thee is very happy, I think. Thee has no mamma to scold thee when thee tears thy frocks." During one of the campaigns which I made in the train of the Emperor, I one day wrote to my wife to ask her for some details of the life which she and her sister led at Malmaison. She wrote to me, among other things. I transcribe a passage of her response. "We sometimes played parts in buffooneries beyond my conception. One evening the salon was divided in 2 by a gauze, behind which was a bed draped in the Greek style, and on this bed a sleeping man wrapped in large white draperies. Near the sleeper, Madame Bonaparte and the other ladies beat time, and besides, not always exactly, on bronze vases, which made a terrible music. During this racket, one of those gentlemen held me by the middle of the body up from the ground, and I moved my arms and legs in regular time. The concert of the ladies awoke the sleeper, who opened big eyes on me and seemed to be frightened by my gestures. He rose and moved rapidly away, followed by my brother, who crawled on his hands and feet, I think to imitate a dog that this strange personage was supposed to have. As I was then quite a child, I have only a confused idea of all this, but Madame Bonaparte's company appeared to be very much amused by it. When the first consul went to live at St. Cloud, he said some flattering things to my father-in-law and gave him to the conciergerie of the chateau. It was a place of confidence, the details and responsibility of which were considerable. Monsieur Charvet was commissioned to reorganize the service, and by the first consul's orders, he selected from among the former servants of the Queen for the places of porters, floor polishers, and chateau servants. Those incapacitated for duty were pensioned. When the fire broke out at the chateau in 1802, as I have previously related, Madame Charvet, who was in delicate health, had a great fright. It was not thought advisable to bleed her. She had an unfortunate delivery and died before she was 30. Louise had been away at school for some years. Her father recalled her that she might keep house for him. She was then 12 years old. One of her friends was kindly communicated to me a letter written by her, by Louise, shortly after our marriage, from which I make the following extract. On my return from boarding school, I went to see Her Majesty the Empress, then Madame Bonaparte, at the Tuileries. I was in deep mourning. She took me on her lap, comforted me, said she would be my mother, and would find me a husband. I cried and said I did not want to be married. Not at present, returned Her Majesty, but that will happen, you may be sure. I was not persuaded, however, that this mortification must come to me. I received some more caresses and came away. When the first consul was at St. Cloud, it was at my father's apartment that all the heads of the different services assembled, for my father is much beloved by the household of which he is the oldest member. Monsieur Constant, who had seen me as a child at Malmaison, found me sufficiently sensible at St. Cloud to ask me of my father with the approbation of their majesties. It was decided that we should be married after the coronation. I was 14 years old a fortnight after our marriage. My sister and I were always received with extreme kindness by Her Majesty the Empress, and when, fearing to weary her, we did not go to see her for some time, she complained about it to my father. She admitted us to her morning toilette. They laced her stays and dressed her before us. There was no one in her chamber but her women, and some persons of the household, who, like us, count among their sweetest moments those in which they could see this adored princess. Familiar talk is always full of charm. Her Majesty sometimes told anecdotes, not a word of which either of us recalls. Her Majesty the Empress had promised Louise a dowry, but the money intended for it had been spent otherwise, and my wife had nothing but a few little jewels or 2 or 3 pieces of stuff. Monsieur Charvet was too delicate to remind Her Majesty of her promise. Now, one never got anything from her without that, for she could neither economize nor refuse. Sometimes after my marriage, the emperor asked me what the empress had given my wife, and seemed extremely dissatisfied when I told him. Doubtless because the sum asked from him for Louise's dowry had received another destination. On this subject, His Majesty the Emperor had the kindness to assure me that henceforward it should be his business to provide for my fortune, that he was satisfied with my services, and that he would prove it to me. I have said above that it was my wife's younger sister who was the favorite of Her Majesty the Empress. Nevertheless, she did not receive, when she married, a richer dowry than that of Louise, but the Empress wished to see my sister-in-law's husband. And she said to him with a truly maternal accent, "Sir, I recommend my daughter to you and beg you to make her happy. She deserves it. And I shall think very ill of you if you do not know how to appreciate her." When my sister-in-law, escaping from Compiègne in 1814 with her mother-in-law, went to Évreux for her delivery, the Empress, who heard of it, sent her first valet de chambre to her with all she thought necessary for a young woman in that condition. She even reproached her for not having alighted at Navarre. My sister-in-law had been educated in the same boarding school as Mademoiselle Josephine Tallien, goddaughter of the Empress, who has since married Monsieur Pellet de la Lozère, and another daughter of Madame Tallien, Mademoiselle Clémence Cabarrus. The school was directed by Madame Vigogne, widow of the colonel of that name, and an old friend of the Empress, who had induced her to take a boarding school and promised to secure her as many pupils as she could. The institution prospered under the direction of this lady, who was of distinguished intelligence and perfect manners. She often brought to the Empress the protégés of the latter and other young persons who had deserved this award. It was a powerful means to excite emulation in these children, whom Her Majesty covered with caresses, and to whom she made little presents. One morning, when Madame Vigogne had dressed to go and see the Empress, as she was coming downstairs to go to her carriage, she heard piercing screams from one of the classrooms. She ran thither and beheld a young girl whose clothes were all in flames. With a presence of mind worthy of a mother, Madame Vigogne had gone and at once enveloped the child in the train of her long dress and put out the fire, but the hands of the courageous teacher were cruelly burned. She went in this condition to make her call upon Her Majesty the Empress, and related to her the wretched accident which had caused it. Her Majesty, who was easily moved by all that was fine and generous, was so affected that she wept with admiration. One of Her Majesty's physicians was charged to give the first attentions to Madame Vigogne and her young pupil. Chapter 5. The Empress Josephine was of medium height and singularly well made. There was a suppleness and lightness in her movements which gave an almost aerial glance to her bearing, yet without detracting from the majesty of a sovereign. Her expressive physiognomy translated all the impressions of her soul without ever losing the charming sweetness which was its basis. In pleasure as in sadness, she was beautiful to behold. You smiled in spite of yourself on seeing her smile. If she was sad, you were so likewise. Never did any woman justify more fully than she the saying that the eyes are the mirror of the soul. Hers, of a deep blue, were almost always half closed by her long lids, slightly arched and fringed by the most beautiful lashes in the world, and when she looked thus, one felt drawn towards her by an irresistible power. It would have been difficult for the Empress to impart any severity to this seductive glance, but she could, and it need knew how to render it imposing. Her hair was very beautiful, long and silky, and its pale chestnut color blended admirably with her skin, dazzling with a delicacy and freshness. At the beginning of her supreme power, the Empress still liked to put a red madras handkerchief on her head in the morning, which gave her a most piquant Creole-like appearance. But what contributed more than anything else to the all-pervading charm of the Empress was the ravishing sound of her voice. How many times it has happened to me, as to so many others, to stop suddenly on hearing this voice, solely to enjoy the pleasure of listening to it. Perhaps it could not be said that the Empress was a beautiful woman, but her face, so full of sentiment and kindness, and the angelic grace diffused over her whole person, made her the most attractive of women. During her residence at St. Cloud, Her Majesty habitually rose at 9 o'clock and made her first toilette, which lasted until 10. Then she passed into a salon where the persons who had solicited and obtained the favor of an audience were assembled. Sometimes also at this hour, and in the same salon, Her Majesty receipts or purveyors. At 11 o'clock, when the emperor was absent, she breakfasted with her first lady of honor and some other ladies. Madame de la Rochefoucauld, her first lady of honor, was humpbacked and so small that when she placed herself at table, it was necessary to add to the cushion already on her chair another very thick one of violet satin. Madame de la Rochefoucauld knew how to redeem her physical deformities by her wit, keen and brilliant, but a trifle caustic, by the highest breeding and the most exquisite court manners. After the breakfast, the empress would have a game of billiards, or, when the weather was fine, she would walk in the garden or the enclosed park. This recreation only lasted a short time, and Her Majesty, on returning to apartments, employed herself at her embroidery frame in chatting with her ladies, who were also busy with some sort of needlework. When it happened that there were no unexpected visitors between 2 and 3, the empress rode out in an open carriage, and on her return the grand toilette was made. Sometimes the emperor was present at it. Occasionally also the emperor came to surprise Her Majesty in the salon. Then he was always sure to be amusing, amiable, and gay. Dinner was served at 6, but more often than not the emperor forgot it and kept the table waiting indefinitely. More than one dinner was eaten between 9 and 10 in the evening. Their Majesties dined together, either alone or in company with a few guests, princes of the imperial family or ministers, unless there were either concert, reception, or play. Everybody retired at midnight. Then the empress, who liked to sit up late, played at backgammon with one of the chamberlains. Usually it was Count de Beaumont, who was thus honored. On hunting days, the empress and her ladies followed the chase in open carriages. There was a costume for that purpose. It was a sort of green riding habit with a toque ornamented with white feathers. All the ladies who followed the hunt dined with their majesties. When the empress came to pass the night in the apartment of the emperor, I went in, as usual, between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning. It was seldom that I did not find the august pair already awake. The emperor generally asked me for some tea or an infusion of orange leaves, and rose at once. The empress would smilingly say to him, "Are you getting up already? Stay a little longer. Well, you're not sleeping?" His Majesty would answer. Then he would roll her up in the coverings, pat her cheeks and shoulders, and laugh as he kissed her. At the end of a few minutes, the empress would rise in her turn, slip on a morning gown, and read the journals, or else go down to her apartment by the private stairs. She never left that of His Majesty without addressing me some words invariably expressive of kindness and the most touching goodwill. Elegant and simple in her dress, the empress submitted with reluctance to the necessity of ostentatious toilettes. Jewels were the only things she cared much about. She had always liked them, hence the emperor gave them to her often and in great abundance. It was a pleasure to her to adorn herself with them, and still greater one to show them. One morning when my wife had gone to see her at her toilette, Her Majesty related to her that, when she was newly married to Monsieur de Beauharnais, being enchanted at the ornaments he had given her, she used to carry them in her pockets. Pockets were an essential part of women's dress in those days, and display them to her young friends. As the empress was speaking of her pockets, she ordered one of her ladies to go and find a pair to show to my wife. The lady to whom she addressed herself could hardly repress her longing to laugh at this singular request, and she assured Her Majesty that nothing of the sort was now to be found in her linen room. The empress responded regretfully that she was sorry, as it would have given her pleasure to see once more a pair of her old pockets. The years had brought great changes. The jewels of the Empress Josephine could hardly have been contained in the pockets of Madame de Beauharnais, no matter how long and deep they might have been. The jewel press which had belonged to Queen Marie Antoinette, and which had never been quite full, was too small for the empress, and when she wanted one day to show all her ornaments to some ladies who expressed a wish to see them, a large table had to be set up to lay the jewel cases on, and the table not sufficing, several other pieces of furniture were covered with them. Kind to excess, as everybody knows, sensitive beyond expression, generous to prodigality, the empress formed the happiness of all who surrounded her, cherishing her husband with a tenderness which nothing could change, and which was as keen as her last sigh, as when Madame de Beauharnais and General Bonaparte made the avowal of their mutual love. Josephine was long the only woman loved by the Emperor, and she deserved to be so always. How touching was the accord of the imperial couple during several years! Full of deference, of attention, and unreserved for Josephine, the Emperor loved to kiss her neck, her face, to give her little pats and call her my big dunce. True, this did not prevent his being guilty of some infidelities towards her, but without failing in other respects in his conjugal duties. On her part, the Empress adored him and tormented herself to find means of pleasing him, of divining his intentions so as to anticipate his slightest wishes. At first, she made her husband jealous, strongly prejudiced against her during the Egyptian campaign by indiscreet reports. The emperor had explanations with the empress after his return, which did not always terminate without cries and acts of violence, but calm was soon restored and seldom disturbed afterwards. The emperor could not resist such charms and so much sweetness. The empress had a prodigious memory, which the emperor often laid under contribution. She was an excellent musician, played the harp very well, and sang with taste. Her tact was perfect, and she had an exquisite sentiment of what was befitting, and the sanest, most infallible judgment it's possible to imagine. Of a temper always sweet and uniform, as obliging to her enemies as to her friends, she restored peace wherever there had been quarreling or discord. When the emperor was angry with his brothers or with other persons, as frequently happened, the empress would say a few words and all would be settled. When she asked a pardon, the emperor seldom failed to grant it, no matter how serious might have been the fault committed. I could cite many examples of pardons thus solicited and obtained. One fact, which is almost personal to me, will sufficiently prove that the intercession of this good empress was all-powerful. The first valet de chambre of Her Majesty had somewhat overheated himself at breakfast with some friends. The nature of his duties obliged him to assist at meals and to stand behind the Empress in order to change the plates. On this day, excited by the vapors of the champagne he had taken, he unfortunately let drop some offensive words, pronounced, it is true, in an undertone, but by an unlucky chance overheard by the emperor. His Majesty gave Monsieur Frere a terrible look, which made him sensible of the gravity of his fault, and when dinner was over, the emperor ordered the imprudent valet's dismissal in a tone which left nothing to be hoped for, and admitted of no reply. Monsieur Frere was an excellent servant, a gentle, upright, and honest man. His present fault was the first of this kind with which he could be reproached, and consequently it deserved some indulgence. Some applications were made to the Grand Marshal, but he refused his intercession, knowing so well the inflexibility of the emperor. Several other persons to whom the poor fellow went to beg them to speak for him answered as the Grand Marshal had done, so that Monsieur Frey came in despair to bid us adieu. I ventured to undertake his cause. I hoped that by choosing the favorable moment I might succeed in inducing His Majesty to reconsider. The order of dismissal required Monsieur Frere to quit the palace within 24 hours. I advised him not to obey, but to remain carefully hidden in his chamber, which he did. That evening at the coucher, His Majesty spoke to me of what had occurred and showed much anger. I thought silence was the most prudent thing for me, and I waited. The next morning, the Empress had the goodness to send me word that she would be present at her husband's toilette, and that if I thought proper to broach the question, she would abet me with all her might. In effect, seeing the emperor in a rather good humor, I spoke of Monsieur Frere, and depicting to His Majesty the poor man's regrets, I laid before him the reasons which might excuse the levity of his conduct. Sire, said I, he is a good man, who has no fortune, and who supports a numerous family. If he leaves the service of Her Majesty the Empress, no one will believe that it is for a fault due to wine, rather than to him, and he will be ruined forever. To these words, as to many other entreaties, the emperor replied only by interruptions that showed entire aversion to the pardon I was soliciting. Happily, the empress kindly joined me and said to her husband in her touching and expressive voice, my dear, if you will forgive him, you will please me. Emboldened by this powerful patronage, I began my entreaties anew, to which the emperor replied brusquely, addressing both the empress and me. In a word, you wish it? Well, let him say then.